He was the son of a wealthy family who chose to sweep floors for a living. At 16 years old, he put on overalls, picked up a lunch pail, and walked into one of the loudest, filthiest, most dangerous workplaces in the world. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to learn every single job before he ever gave an order. You would think a boy born into money would take the easy path, right? Skip the grunt work, start at the top. Well, Thomas Andrews would go on to design and help build the largest, most luxurious moving object human beings had ever created, a 46,000-ton ship stretching longer than 4 city blocks, carrying over 2,200 people, celebrated around the world as unsinkable. He would rise from an apprentice sweeping sawdust off a shipyard floor to managing director of the largest shipbuilding company on Earth. And then, on the night his masterpiece was dying beneath his feet, he would refuse to save himself. So how does a poor boy, not poor in the way we usually mean it, but poor in the sense that mattered to him, poor in status among the men whose respect he desperately needed to earn, end up building the ship that would define a century? To find out, we have to go back to February 7th, 1873, in a small linen town in the north of Ireland. Thomas Andrews Jr. was born in Comber, County Down, into a family that, on paper, had everything. His father sat on the Privy Council of Ireland. His mother, Eliza Peary, came from a family entangled in Belfast's booming linen trade. His brothers would go on to become a Prime Minister and a Lord Chief Justice. By every measure that mattered to Victorian society, Thomas Andrews had already won the game of life before he had taken a single breath. But here's the thing about the Andrews family. They didn't believe in handing children a title and calling it a career. Thomas grew up riding horses, keeping bees, and playing cricket in the green fields around Ardara House, an idyllic, comfortable childhood that gave no hint of the grease and rivet noise that would define his adult life. He was educated by private tutors until 11, then sent to the Royal Belfast Academical Institution, where teachers remembered him as diligent rather than brilliant. Not the smartest boy in the room, just the most stubborn. And that stubbornness would matter more than any classroom ever could. Belfast itself was a city on fire with industrial ambition in those years. Linen mills, rope works, and shipyards had transformed it from a modest port town into one of the great industrial powerhouses of the British Empire, rivaling Glasgow and Liverpool for sheer manufacturing output. Growing up in this environment, young Thomas would have seen firsthand what large-scale industry could do, both the wealth it generated for families like his own, and the grinding, dangerous labor it demanded from the thousands of ordinary men who actually built things with their hands. That contrast between comfort at home and hardship on the docks would shape everything about how he later chose to lead. You see, Thomas had an uncle, a man named William Peary, who happened to be a partner and soon the chairman of a shipbuilding firm called Harland and Wolff, tucked into the docks of Belfast. By the 1880s, Harland and Wolff was not just another shipyard. It was becoming the largest and most advanced shipbuilding operation on the planet, employing thousands of men across an 80-acre site on Queen's Island, hammering together the ocean liners that connected continents. Peary saw something in his nephew, not favoritism, potential. And in 1889, at 16 years old, he arranged for Thomas to begin what was called a premium apprenticeship at the yard. Here's where most wealthy 16-year-olds would have expected a desk, a title, and a shortcut. Thomas Andrews got none of that. His uncle insisted he start exactly where every other apprentice started, at the very bottom. And Thomas never once complained about it. In fact, he seemed to want it that way. This is the flaw that would follow him his entire career. Except it wasn't really a flaw at all, not in the way flaws usually work in stories like this. Thomas Andrews' weakness was that he refused to believe he deserved anything he hadn't personally earned with his own hands. To the other apprentices, the nephew of the boss should have been untouchable, coasting through on family connections. Instead, he showed up every day covered in the same sawdust and grime as everyone else, and that confused people. Surely the boss's nephew would cut corners. Surely he'd disappear the moment things got difficult. He never did, and the men noticed. Thomas Andrews had achieved something few wealthy young men of his era ever managed: genuine respect from the working men of Belfast docks. But that respect wasn't going to be handed to him twice. He was about to learn just how brutal, exhausting, and unforgiving the shipbuilding trade truly was. And the world was about to test whether the boss's nephew had what it actually took. You have to understand what Belfast shipyards actually looked like at that time to appreciate what Andrews was walking into. This wasn't some polite trade with tidy workshops and quiet supervisors. It was thousands of men working at height on scaffolding, around molten rivets glowing orange hot, hurled by a hand from a furnace to a catcher who'd snatch them out of the air in a metal cup before hammering them into place. A single mistake could kill you or the man standing next to you. Deaths and serious injuries at Harland and Wolff weren't rare tragedies. They were an accepted grim cost of doing business in an era before modern safety regulation existed at all. Belfast shipyards were also divided by the same religious and sectarian tensions that split the rest of the city, and a boss's nephew who couldn't earn the trust of Protestant and Catholic tradesmen alike would never survive a single afternoon on the yard floor, let alone build a career there. For the first 3 months, Andrews worked in the joiner's shop, learning to shape wood by hand, then a month with the cabinet makers, building the fine interior fittings that would one day grace first-class staterooms. Then 2 grueling months out on the ships themselves, exposed to the weather, hauling material across scaffolding hundreds of feet in the air. Harland and Wolff apprentices worked brutal hours, up before dawn, home after dark, 6 days a week, for wages that barely covered lodging. Many quit within the first year. The work was loud, dangerous, and physically punishing, and it broke boys who'd grown up with far less privilege than Thomas Andrews. But Andrews didn't quit. Every evening, after a full day of physical labor, he went home and studied mathematics, engineering principles, naval architecture texts by lamplight, long after most 16-year-olds would have collapsed into bed. He was determined to understand not just how to build a ship with his hands, but why every rivet, every plate, every compartment existed the way it did. This discipline would pay off faster than anyone expected. By the final 18 months of his 5-year apprenticeship, Andrews had earned a seat in the drawing office, the nerve center of the shipyard, where naval architects translated raw ambition into blueprints. It was there, hunched over drafting tables among some of the finest engineering minds in Britain, that Thomas Andrews found what he was actually built for. However, understanding the theory of shipbuilding was one thing. Proving you could run an entire operation was another problem entirely, and Andrews was about to discover just how far he still had to climb. By 1901, nearly 12 years after he'd first swept that shipyard floor, Andrews had worked his way through department after department: joinery, drawing, structural design, engine construction, absorbing every discipline the yard had to offer. That year, he was named a member of the Institution of Naval Architects and promoted to assistant manager of the construction works. He was 28 years old, and he had touched, quite literally with his own hands, nearly every part of what it took to build an ocean liner from empty steel to finished ship. This mattered enormously because Harland and Wolff was entering an arms race. Their great rival, Cunard, was about to launch two record-breaking liners, the Lusitania and the Mauretania, both faster and grander than anything afloat. The White Star Line, Harland and Wolff's most important client, needed an answer. Not a faster ship, a different kind of ship entirely, one built on size, luxury, and safety rather than speed. And who would be trusted to help design it? In 1907, at a now legendary dinner at Lord Pirrie's London home, White Star's chairman J. Bruce Ismay and Pirrie began sketching the outline of three enormous sister ships that would tower over anything Cunard could build. That same year, Thomas Andrews, just 34 years old, was appointed managing director of Harland and Wolff's construction works and head of the drawing office where those three ships would take shape: the Olympic, the Titanic, the Britannic. The scale of the ambition here is almost impossible to overstate. Each of these three ships would cost roughly £1.5 million to build, somewhere north of $7 million at the time, and the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars today. Harland and Wolff wasn't just building a boat. They were betting the future of the entire company, and by extension, the economic future of Belfast itself, on three ships that had never been attempted at this size before. This is the part of the story where you'd expect Andrews to simply hand down orders from an office high above the shipyard floor, wouldn't you? Most executives at that level did exactly that, but Andrews wasn't most executives. Every single morning, he walked the yard himself, inspecting the actual steel, talking to the actual welders and riveters, remembering their names, asking about their families. Workers would later describe him crawling through half-finished double bottoms and cramped boiler rooms in his overalls, checking measurements with his own hands rather than trusting reports from subordinates. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it explains everything that follows. Thomas Andrews never stopped being the 16-year-old apprentice. He'd become one of the most powerful men in British shipbuilding, and he still insisted on personally verifying every detail himself. But this obsessive attention to detail was about to collide with a problem money and status could never fix: the sheer, staggering scale of what he'd been asked to build. Construction on the RMS Titanic began on March 31st, 1909, in a massive slipway alongside her sister ship Olympic. To even build these two ships side by side, Harland and Wolff had to construct an entirely new gantry system, one of the largest ever built, towering over the yard like a steel cathedral. 15,000 men worked at the shipyard during this period. An army of riveters, platers, electricians, joiners, and engineers, all coordinated under the drawing office Andrews now ran. Every single day brought 1,000 tiny crises that could have derailed the entire project. Steel plates arrived warped, rivets failed quality inspections, skilled tradesmen were poached by competing yards. Andrews, despite now overseeing thousands of workers and multiple simultaneous ship projects, insisted on reviewing an enormous share of the technical drawings personally. Colleagues later recalled him working past midnight, marking up blueprints with corrections, then arriving back at the yard before sunrise the next morning. Because here's what almost nobody outside the industry understood. Building an ocean liner of Titanic size wasn't really one project. It was thousands of overlapping projects: hull structure, propulsion, electrical systems, plumbing, decorative woodwork, lifeboat davits, wireless equipment, all of which had to be designed, sequenced, and executed without a single catastrophic error, on a vessel that would eventually weigh over 46,000 tons and stretch 882 feet from bow to stern. Andrews would spend nearly 3 years of his life almost entirely consumed by this one ship. That cost wasn't only measured in money. Construction records would later show that at least 8 men lost their lives building Titanic's hull, and hundreds more suffered serious injuries, crushed limbs, falls from the gantry, burns from the rivet furnaces. Andrews knew several of these men personally, by name, the same way he'd known the tradesmen he'd apprenticed alongside years earlier. Every death was logged, investigated, and then the work continued the next morning, because that was simply the reality of shipbuilding at this scale in the 1910s in Belfast. On May 31st, 1911, Titanic's bare steel hull was finally ready to leave dry land. Roughly 100,000 people crowded the banks of the River Lagan to watch her slide into the water for the first time. Not a finished ship yet, just an empty shell of riveted steel without engines, funnels, or a single stick of furniture aboard. Following Harland and Wolff tradition, there was no champagne bottles smashed against her bow, no christening ceremony at all. The moment was almost eerily quiet. 22 tons of tallow, soap, and train oil greased the slipway, and gravity did the rest. 22 seconds later, Titanic was afloat. Andrews watched from the yard, knowing this was only the beginning. The hardest, most detailed work, the engines, the electrical wiring, the decoration of nearly 900 rooms still lay ahead. But Titanic wasn't being built in isolation. Her sister, Olympic, launched first on October 20th, 1910, and entered service the following June to enormous fanfare as the largest ship in the world. Andrews should have been able to breathe easier once Olympic was successfully afloat and sailing, paying customers across the Atlantic. Instead, disaster struck almost immediately. On September 20th, 1911, Olympic collided with a Royal Navy cruiser, HMS Hawke, just off the English coast, tearing a massive gash in her starboard hull. Nobody died, but the damage was severe enough that Olympic had to return to Belfast for extensive repairs. Here's the problem this created. Harland and Wolff's yard had exactly one gantry large enough to accommodate a ship of this size, and Titanic was sitting underneath it, weeks from her own completion. To repair Olympic, workers had to pull materials, and in some cases entire crews, off Titanic's construction and redirect them toward patching up her wounded sister. Andrews watched his own ship's timeline slip by nearly a month, all because of an accident he had absolutely no control over. Would Titanic's launch schedule survive this setback? Would the White Star Line tolerate yet another delay after already waiting years for their flagship? For a company staking its entire future on delivering these ships on time, every lost week was a lost fortune. And yet, even with all his obsessive oversight, a darker tension was quietly building in the background, one that had nothing to do with steel or rivets and everything to do with money. You see, Andrews wasn't just an engineer. As managing director, he answered to the White Star Line's demands and to his uncle Lord Pirrie's business priorities, both of which increasingly clashed with his own instincts as a designer. Andrews reportedly pushed for Titanic to carry a far greater number of lifeboats than the minimum legal requirement, enough for every soul aboard. But the White Star Line's leadership, worried about cluttering the elegant promenade's decks with rows of unsightly boats, scaled that number down. The ship would ultimately carry only 20 lifeboats, enough for roughly half the people she was designed to hold. This wasn't a secret failure hidden in some private memo. It was legal. It matched, and even exceeded, the outdated British Board of Trade regulations of the era, which hadn't been updated in years, despite the increasing size of ocean liners. Nobody at the time considered it reckless. The ship, after all, was believed to be unsinkable, divided into 16 watertight compartments with doors that could seal automatically at the flip of a switch on the bridge. Surely a ship built with that kind of redundancy would never need enough lifeboats for everyone. Surely the boats were just a formality, Andrews, ever the realist, understood the compartment system's actual limits better than almost anyone alive. He knew the watertight bulkheads didn't extend all the way up to the deck above, a design compromise made to preserve the grand, uninterrupted feel of first-class public spaces. If enough compartments flooded, water could simply spill over the top of one bulkhead into the next, like water pouring over ice cube trays lined up in a row. He knew this, and still the ship sailed anyway, on schedule, under enormous commercial pressure to prove Harland and Wolff and White Star could deliver the grandest vessel the world had ever seen. By early 1912, after 2.5 years of round-the-clock work, Titanic was finally ready. On April 2nd, she completed her sea trials in Belfast. Andrews, exhausted but proud, watched his creation move under her own power for the first time. Days later, she sailed for Southampton to begin final preparations for her maiden voyage. Andrews didn't stay behind to celebrate. Instead, he did something almost nobody in his position would have bothered to do. He boarded the ship himself, leading a small team from Harland and Wolff called the Guarantee Group. 9 men whose job was to observe every system on the maiden voyage, take notes on anything that needed fixing, and report back for future improvements. He could have sent junior engineers. He chose to go himself, cataloguing squeaky doors, a stiff drawer here, a paint scuff there, obsessing over details so minor that most passengers wouldn't have noticed them in 1,000 crossings. On April 10, 1912, the RMS Titanic departed Southampton on her maiden voyage to New York, carrying more than 2,200 passengers and crew, among the wealthiest and most famous people in the world. And Thomas Andrews, the boy who once swept sawdust off a shipyard floor, walked her decks not as a passenger, but as the man who knew every inch of her better than anyone alive. On April 14th, Andrews reportedly told a friend over dinner that Titanic was, in his words, as nearly perfect as human brains can make her. He had every reason to believe it. The ship was performing beautifully. Passengers marveled at her opulence. The crossing was smooth. He had no idea that in a matter of hours, everything he'd built his entire life around would be tested in the most catastrophic way imaginable. Throughout that same day, wireless operators aboard Titanic had received no fewer than 6 separate warnings from nearby ships about ice fields directly in her path. Some of these warnings reached the bridge. At least one, sent late in the evening from a nearby steamer called the Californian, apparently never made it past the wireless room at all, buried under a backlog of personal messages from wealthy passengers eager to send word ahead to New York. Titanic was steaming through a known ice field at a speed of roughly 22 knots on a clear, moonless night that made icebergs nearly impossible to spot until they were dangerously close. None of this alarmed anyone aboard. Ice warnings were common on the North Atlantic run. Nobody imagined they'd matter enough to slow down for. At 11:40 p.m. that night, Titanic struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic. Most passengers barely felt it, a faint shudder, a slight jolt, nothing more. Many didn't even wake up. But Andrews knew ships, and ships don't lie to the men who build them. Captain Edward Smith summoned Andrews immediately, and together they descended into the bowels of the ship to inspect the damage themselves. What they found should have been impossible. The iceberg had sliced open several compartments along nearly 300 feet of the hull, far more than the ship's watertight system had ever been designed to survive. Water was pouring into at least 5, possibly 6, of the 16 compartments simultaneously. And Andrews understood something no one else on that ship fully grasped in that moment. Titanic could stay afloat with 4 compartments flooded, maybe even 5, if things went well, but not 6. He did the math in his head. standing in freezing seawater in the mailroom 2 decks below where any passenger could see. And the number he arrived at was almost too horrifying to say out loud. Titanic had, at most, 2 hours left to live. Everything Andrews had worked for, the apprenticeship, the drawing office, the sleepless nights hunched over blueprints, the promotion to managing director, the 3 years of his life poured into this single ship. All of it collapsed into this one impossible moment. He could tell Captain Smith the truth and trigger mass panic aboard a ship with lifeboats for barely half its passengers. Or he could stay silent and let more people die in ignorance. He chose the truth. Andrews delivered his verdict to Captain Smith privately, then turned and moved through the ship at a run. For the next hour and a half, Thomas Andrews did something almost no engineer in history has ever been asked to do. He became a one-man emergency response team aboard the very disaster he had helped create. Survivors would later describe him tearing through corridors, banging on cabin doors, ripping blankets and lifebelts from linen closets, and shoving them into stewards' arms. "Put your lifebelts on and come on deck," he was reported to shout, room after room, deck after deck. He personally directed passengers toward the boat deck, urged reluctant women into half-filled lifeboats, and reportedly told hesitant crowds, "There is not a moment to lose. You cannot pick and choose your boat. Don't hesitate. Get in." He knew, better than any of the 2,200 souls aboard, exactly how much time remained, and he spent every second of it saving strangers instead of himself. Multiple crew members later reported seeing Andrews alone in the first-class smoking room in Titanic's final hour, staring silently at a painting of Plymouth Harbour above the fireplace, his lifebelt discarded on a nearby table. Whether that specific image is entirely accurate has been debated for over a century. The account traces back to a steward who left the ship well before that time. But what survivors agreed on, unanimously, was this: Thomas Andrews never once tried to save himself. Stewardess Mary Sloan, who survived, would later write that Mr. Andrews met his fate like a true hero, realizing the great danger, and gave up his life to save the women and children of the Titanic. At 2:20 in the morning on April 15, 1912, less than 3 hours after striking the iceberg, RMS Titanic broke apart and sank beneath the North Atlantic, taking more than 1,500 people down with her. Thomas Andrews was among them. His body, like the vast majority of Titanic's dead, was never recovered. He was 39 years old. He wasn't alone in that sacrifice. All 9 members of his hand-picked guarantee group, the very men he had brought aboard to help perfect his creation, died that night as well. Not one of them survived. They had joined the maiden voyage to catalogue squeaky hinges and stiff drawers. Instead, they became some of the ship's most consequential casualties, a group of engineers who quite literally went down with the ship they'd spent years building, to the last man. Here's what's remarkable when you sit with the full shape of this story. Thomas Andrews had spent his entire career trying to earn something he was never actually required to earn: the genuine respect of working men who owed him nothing and expected him to be just another rich man's nephew coasting on family money. And in the final hours of his life, aboard the greatest and most catastrophic achievement of his career, that exact instinct to never ask of others what he would not do himself is what defined him in the eyes of history. He did not design lifeboats for the wealthy first. He did not disappear into a boat under an assumed name, the way at least one other prominent man aboard that night was accused of doing. He ran toward the danger, the same way he had once walked into a shipyard as a 16-year-old determined to sweep floors alongside everyone else. When asked years earlier about his approach to shipbuilding, Andrews had insisted that a man could only truly understand a ship by knowing it in every rivet and every plate, treating no detail as too small for his direct attention. That philosophy, obsessive as it sounds, is exactly why survivors could later testify with such specific, detailed clarity about what he did in Titanic's final hours. He had spent his whole life training himself to notice everything. In the end, that meant noticing every terrified passenger who needed a lifebelt, a direction, a shove toward a lifeboat, and a reason not to give up. And I think that's really the part of this story worth sitting with the longest. We tend to remember Titanic as a tale about hubris, about a company and a culture so convinced of their own genius that they forgot the ocean does not care how much money you have spent or how many watertight compartments you have installed. That's true, and it's an important lesson. But buried inside that larger tragedy is a much smaller, much more human story about one specific man who spent his entire life trying to prove he had earned his place among people who owed him nothing, and who, when the moment finally came to prove it for real, did not hesitate for a single second. The inquiries that followed the disaster, one in the United States, one in Britain, would spend months dissecting the lifeboat shortage, the ice warnings ignored, the watertight compartments that weren't watertight enough. Maritime law changed permanently as a result. The International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, first adopted in 1914, mandated lifeboat space for every person aboard a ship, 24-hour wireless watches, and international ice patrols in the North Atlantic, rules that still protect passengers on every ocean liner and cruise ship sailing today. News of the disaster reached Belfast within days, and the city that had built Titanic with such pride fell into genuine collective grief. Entire streets of workers' families had lost fathers, brothers, and sons among the crew and the guarantee group. Flags across the shipyard flew at half-mast. For a city that had poured 3 years of its labor and identity into this single ship, the sinking wasn't just a maritime disaster reported in faraway newspapers. It was a wound that touched nearly every family connected to Queen's Island. Today, the Titanic Quarter in Belfast stands where Harland and Wolff's slipways once rang with the sound of 15,000 hammers. The Titanic Belfast Museum draws hundreds of thousands of visitors every year to the exact patch of ground where a 16-year-old boy from a linen trade family once swept sawdust off a shipyard floor, determined to prove he belonged among the men who actually built things. Harland and Wolff's giant Samson and Goliath cranes still tower over the city skyline, visible from nearly anywhere in Belfast. A permanent monument to an industry that, for a few remarkable decades, made this small Irish city the shipbuilding capital of the entire world. But Thomas Andrews' real legacy was never really about the ship itself. Ships get built and ships get lost. That's simply the risk of the trade. His legacy is in the outdated safety laws his death helped rewrite, in the maritime regulations that now require enough lifeboats for every soul aboard every passenger vessel on Earth, and in a single, enduring proof that character isn't inherited along with money or title. It's built the same way a ship is built, plate by plate, rivet by rivet, one honest day of work at a time. Thomas Andrews never got the chance to fix the ship he loved, but in his final 90 minutes on Earth, he built something arguably more lasting than Titanic ever could have been, an example of exactly what a person owes to the people around them when everything is falling apart.